Hello and welcome to RT 24-hour news live from Moscow. My name is Yulia Shapovalova. To our main story now. Russian President Vladimir Putin has hit out at the allegations that Assad's government carried out a chemical attack against its own people, warning the US against military intervention. He also added Washington's claims the full intelligence report providing firm evidence cannot be published are disrespectful to its international partners. RT's Sean Thomas has more now on Russia's reaction to the US drums of war.
President Vladimir Putin was addressing the press in Vladivostok, and he did have some strong words to say on the subject of Syria. He said that Russia is, of course, against the use of chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction. But in this particular case, we need to wait and see for the UN to do their job, for the investigation to come forward, and, as Russia's position has always been, then act in a lawful manner as a global community. Now, one of the things he says is that it is ridiculous that the Assad regime used weapons, chemical weapons, against his own people, saying that under these circumstances it just doesn't call for it. Let's listen to what he had to say on that subject.
Syrian government forces are advancing. In some areas they've surrounded the rebels. To think that at such a time they would give a trump card to those calling for intervention is utter nonsense.
Now, as the UN chemical weapons inspection team has just left Syria, we haven't heard anything back yet. And he says that if the proof of chemical weapons has not yet been presented, it means that there isn't any. Now, the other thing is he spoke about his surprise about the British government who met over this past week to debate the idea of intervention in Syria. He said he was surprised that they voted down the idea, but that it proves that there are sane, rational people who are out there who are using common sense in this situation. He also appealed to President Obama, not just as a president, but as a Peace Nobel laureate, basically saying, look, if weapons are used, look at what it will do to the peace process. Let's listen to his words on that.
Let's not forget that Barack Obama is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Over the past decade, the US has started several conflicts in various parts of the world. But did that really solve any problems? Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, there's no democracy there now, which is what the US claimed it tried to bring. There's no civil peace or balance. All of this needs to be taken into account before making the decision to start bombing Syria, which will lead to civilian casualties.
So as the world expects a US airstrike at any time, Putin urging restraint at this moment in time.
The UN chief doesn't want military action in Syria until his chemical weapons inspectors present their findings to the Security Council. That could take a couple of weeks, but Washington has said it will decide on what to do regardless of the probe's results. The US appears ready to pull the trigger soon, but much of the world rejects that plan. RT's Gain reports.
Well, the Obama administration is laying the groundwork for a military strike against Syria, but the president says he has not made the final decision. The administration has spent the last few days scrambling an intelligence assessment that would make the case for an attack on Syria. Today, we finally saw that report, the unclassified 4-page version of it. Secretary Kerry presented the report with this. Take a listen.
The American intelligence community has high confidence. High confidence. This is common sense. This is evidence. These are facts. So the primary question is really no longer, what do we know? The question is, what are we collectively, what are we in the world going to do about it?
But if you read the paper, you also come across this line. Our high confidence assessment is the strongest position that the U.S. intelligence community can take, short of confirmation. So U.S. intelligence does not confirm the evidence that the White House says is undeniable. As far as the evidence is concerned, the report shows no evidence as such, just conclusions. Then we have to bear in mind that this was the unclassified version of the report. It mentions satellite images and intercepted communications, but the paper's main argument seems to be this. The Assad government has huge stockpiles of chemical weapons. They have the capacity to deliver them, and therefore they were likely responsible for last week's attacks near Damascus. In the last few days, several members of U.S. intelligence community spoke out on condition of anonymity, saying the actual evidence that the U.S. has is not slam dunk. And there are caveats in the report related to the analysis of the satellite images and the intercepted communications. Also, from Secretary Kerry's presentation, it seems the main selling point for the strikes is the horrible images that we've all seen. The report refers to, several times, it refers to the videos in the social media, but they do not prove who carried out the attacks. Not only the American people are against an attack on Syria, but also the international community, although Secretary Kerry talked about what he sees as a substantial international backing for action. Whatever international backing he was talking about, it's not the UN. Whatever military action the U.S. takes eventually against Syria, it will be illegal under international law. NATO Secretary General just said NATO does not plan to participate in the military intervention in Syria. The UN Security Council is yet to receive the results of the UN investigation, but even that investigation will not reveal who is to blame for the horrific attacks that took place. The inspectors only have a mandate to ascertain the use of chemical weapons, but not by whom they were used. So the key question will still remain up in the air even as we receive the results of that investigation. Nonetheless, the U.S. has already made its judgment.
RT is on Facebook, where you can join the discussion about America's plans to attack Syria. What do our followers say about U.S. warships in the Mediterranean and Obama's hints at an imminent attack? Find out and tell us what you think on facebook.com/RT News. Secretary of State John Kerry said that both he and President Obama believe a military strike on Syria needs to be discussed directly with the American people first. Let's now take a look at what the U.S. public thinks there. And over half of those Americans who took part in a Reuters poll don't want an intervention in Syria. Only 20% are in favor of it. Asked whether Assad should be attacked if he's implicated in chemical weapons use, just under 30% of Americans said yes. The British Parliament wasn't convinced that an attack on Syria should happen, and MP George Galloway was among those who voted against it. And John Kerry's words didn't do anything to change his stance either. Let's now listen.
All the high confidence, full confidence, top conference, and top secret, all the James Bond speak. I recalled it all from the debates leading up to the war on Iraq. And those of us who were saying that these are all lies were treated as either fools or worse by the so-called mainstream media and political class here in the West. Well, this is George Bush all over again, I'm afraid, but this time without the benefit of their traditional ally, Britain. In Britain, in France, in America, hardly anyone supports getting involved in this war as al-Qaeda's air force. Hardly anyone at all. President Obama is making a grave mistake. So grave, I think he cannot properly comprehend it by entering into this war, because once he enters into it, it's going to be much more difficult for him to get out of it.
U.S. taxpayers shelled out more than $100 million for non-lethal aid to the Syrian rebels. The opposition includes al-Qaeda-linked groups too. So America's intervention in Syria might mean the U.S. will be helping someone they consider their sworn enemy. Anastasia Churkina explains.
A major aspect that's close to impossible to prevent in the Syrian crisis should it get even more chaotic and unpredictable with the U.S. and Western outside military involvement, the likelihood of empowering al-Qaeda. Already a very powerful force in the country, experts left and right are warning that the West would be fighting alongside group members in Syria who at home are seen as its own main enemy in the war on terror. The opposition in Syria is far from a unified political force. Al-Qaeda members form a large chunk of this opposition, attempting to get Assad to step down. Concerns were high before that Western ammunition would end up in the wrong hands, because there's no way to selectively support one part of those against Assad's government and not another. The fear now is that U.S. and Western military escapades would enforce not just a vague opposition it sees as the good guy, but the al-Qaeda members that make it up by the thousands. Namely, the al-Nusra Front, considered the most violent element in the opposition, which experts label a rebranded Iraqi al-Qaeda in Syria. Its numbers on the ground are estimated to be at around 6,000 to 10,000 fighters. The larger extent of al-Qaeda's presence in the country, in terms of specific numbers, is not known. But its presence and influence in the future of the country cannot be diminished if historical lessons are remembered. This is already reminiscent of the all too painful experiences we've seen before. Prior to Western involvement in Iraq and Libya, for instance, insurgency ran rampant, but a peak in al-Qaeda's presence walked hand in hand with foreign participation, bringing along terror, suicide bombings, and even greater chaos to those regions.
On air and online as well, we're closely following international tensions brewing over Syria, as well as the situation on the ground. Head to RT.com for live updates. And also on our website, the US government's assessment of the use of chemical weapons in Syria in full. You can read it closer and try to find where Washington's high confidence of Assad's guilt is coming from.